That was me, y'all. All righty. I think we're live. Yes, yes, it says we're live. So, all right. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of My Irreligious Life with your host, Jermaine Thomas, aka The Professor. And this is the live edition of My Irreligious Life podcast. And you'll also be able to hear the audio version of this as well. All right, listen, you all. I have a great friend of mine who, by the way, who is still Christian.
Barely, sometimes it seems.
And you all know in this space, we talk about deconstruction and the deconstructing journey, and how for some people that can be emotionally and psychologically dysregulating. But also in talking about the deconstruction continuum, there's a lot of points and nuances relative to that and how people deconstruct relative to their own experiences, and some who have become stronger in their faith. In some sense, you could say that relative to those that I've heard and talked to, and where they land when they deconstruct. But our conversation today is relative to that, when it comes to human sexuality. I have often said here, on this space or in my podcast relative to human sexuality that, when it comes to religious fundamentalism and the view of sin, or the view of our human physiology, that there has to be a unhinging and an unlearning, that we have to have relative to understanding our human physiology without or outside of a, you can say, a theological lens. And for me, that theological lens was religious fundamentalism, or in high demand religion, and how we view sex. Sex is often a taboo subject, that's often not talked about in church spaces, especially charismatic spaces. I can't speak relative to any other experience in other denominations, but holistically, there seems to be, when it
It's an
comes,
issue across the board. I've
yeah,
been
yeah,
in diverse theological spaces can tell you that whether it is in denominational, non-denominational, fundamental, or even in some cases, quote unquote, liberal, it's definitely a taboo subject matter.
yeah. So there you have it. So it is, to a degree or another, relative to a taboo. And I know for me, in the space that I said in, particularly Pentecostal or charismatic, um, sex sex outside of traditional heteronormative marriage, was the thing, and anything outside of that was the devil, demonic,
Mhm. And,
things like that.
and interestingly enough, just as a tidbit, even when you got into the stereotypical understanding of marriage, there was still historically a very, very strong and stringent stipulations. It was considered, for example, sodomy, from what I was taught, that any kind of non-procreative sexual activity, if it did not include the possibility of reproduction, and then it was deemed inappropriate. Additionally, the idea of a woman having an orgasm or whatnot was considered to be, the kind of activity for a woman to be shamed about, and that, and that in some cases it was held to be proprietous, if I can use that word, for couples who got married, but to also simultaneously abstain from sexual activity. We don't have a good history over the last several hundred years when it comes to determining what is healthy, or what honors, quote unquote, Jesus. Or even that could be a bit problematic. Just anything that was deemed good. We've had a challenge with that.
Yeah, and in the long standing, for me, or in my you could say, deconstructing journey, or in my reading or understanding relative to church history when it comes to human sexuality, and why such this turn, and it's tied to St. Augustine's theory of original sin.
Hmm.
Original sin is a theory, just like a lot of our theological discourses, right? Is rooted in theory, is rooted in Greek thought and philosophy. And so oftentimes when I get into, conversations, cross conversations with other Christians, they tend to not understand the premise and the basis of a lot of our theological discourse is rooted in Greek thought, or Greek thought had a lot of heavy influence in our theological discourse in the shaping of what you would consider the Christian mind today. And St. Augustine's theory relative to that, I found that is that notion or that understanding, right? Not not understanding the discourse, the theological discourse at that time was not just the original sin theory, but also the original blessing, right? That the early church didn't just hold to these rigid ideas relative to sex. That came from the marriage of Christianity to the Roman Empire, and the Roman Church relative to its desire for conquest, in spreading, I guess you could say, the gospel relative to um, that narrative, right? Relative to, then to internal liberation, liberation to the human body, to the mind, to the soul, spirit, and all of that and in between. So, original sin theory to me is the culprit when it comes to demonizing anything relative to sex, because again, like you said, even in Augustine's writings, he talks about, like, this is why we baptize babies, right? because because sin is transferred through sex. So that was a lot of the ideas, the early ideas of sin. Adam and Eve, they disobeyed God, and so sin is a matter of passed on through.
Yeah, this idea of there is a strong propensity towards evil, that, and it's further reinforced by actually taking the statement made by David out of context when he said, "In sin
Yes.
was I formed," and I guess talking. I can't remember the exact quote because I really don't pay attention to it. But talk about how it is that he was formed in sin and shaped in iniquity. Even though David is talking about the fact that his father had, in essence, what would be considered an adulterous affair. So David was born illegitimately, and so that's what is in fact he is speaking about, because he also turns around in another passage of scripture where he says that I am fearfully and wonderfully made. So, it seems to be a contradiction unless you understand what it is that David is speaking to. But yeah, our ideas about sin and this need to police people is in part, it plays a critical role in how it is that we approach any subject matter related to sex, sexuality, gender, orientation, things along those lines, even more so than we'd like to consider it. Which, and it's fascinating though that, and I think for people of faith like myself, it's why understanding scripture as well as is so critically important,
Yeah.
because you end up with a lot of preconceived, twisted notions that are absolutely inaccurate. But one of the fundamental issues we have within many churches today, particularly within the charismatic Pentecostal tradition, is one of great ignorance
Yes.
and a leaning towards a theological construct or any kind of ideology that doesn't require critical thought, that doesn't require engagement with any content or any subject matter outside of what it is that we want to hold on to within our narrow echo chambers, which by the way is absolutely unfaithful to what we see in early church history. I mean, if you look at the writings of Paul the Apostle, when he's attempting to bring to bear the relevance of what it is that he understands to be about Jesus the Christ regarding the church, he draws extensively from bringing understanding and validating what is told by the philosophers and the philosophical, the ideological voices of his day.
Yeah.
And so I think it is dangerous to hold to a theology that is void, that does not leave place and space for the consideration of what is, in fact, a wider body of knowledge,
Yeah.
greater understanding, greater perspective to further correct what is, to be quite honest, many times really shoddy ideas.
Yeah.
And because we don't have that, we keep fostering what turns out to be very archaic ideas that only do damage to people. I'm reading a book about the subject matter of homosexuality, and and how it is that society and why psychologists and medical voices and biologists have fostered a better understanding. And I'm like, when are the people in the church going to finally pay attention to what it is that the modern voices of our day, who do research in ways that we don't, who can help us to better understand what our predecessors may not have understood,
That's right.
and that it doesn't take away from your faith. It actually informs it, enables you to be a better and a more faithful testimony to the gospel that we preach. Because that's the example I see with Paul. Because Paul would take the writings in the Old Testament, what was said by David and others, and he would completely filter it through what he understands to be the revelation of Jesus Christ through the cross, and and give us an understanding that we didn't have. Even Jesus did that with Moses,
Yeah.
with the writings of the law. But I've learned to expect little scholarship and academic thinking when it comes to, sadly, when it comes to those who are considered to be more of the Pentecostal charismatic persuasion.
Yeah, we seen that, and then it has real psychosocial impact, right?
Mhm.
Relative to if I only base my understanding of human physiology, right, relative to our neural setup, our neural wiring, how we're wired neurologically, and how all of that, our biochemistry, right, what it actually articulates, or what happens in the body and the senses
Mhm.
when it comes to sex, right? And even just in simply understanding the chemical reactions and what happens in the brain relative to sex, and not having that insight. And so somebody can have a chemical imbalance, right? That causes them to have a higher sex drive relative to maybe somebody of the same age, physiology, and things like that, right? And so we'll call it the demon of lust.
Yeah, but and even then, within one of the challenges within, believe it or not, and this is no more than 50 years old. You have to understand church history and get into a consideration of all of the various factors that influence a lot of these notions. When you got into the 70s and we saw this kind of emergence of what within occurred within, I guess, the Western world of the spiritual warfare movement,
Yep.
and there was this need to do two things. I think that there was this need to this revived understanding of wickedness and the evil and the devil, because the 60s or whatever apparently was considered a time, at least in these spheres,
Yeah.
to be the faith movement, word of faith movement started to come to bear. So the 70s into the 80s, you get the spiritual warfare movement where everything is a demon, is a devil, because we got, and I think evil does exist. I think there are legitimate powers and influences that foster evil, but part of my concern is a lot of stuff we call evil. I don't think it's a real demon. Like, people want to talk about principalities. I'm like, y'all need to deal with Christian nationalism. That is
Yeah.
wickedness. That I ain't never seen nothing like that. But
Of the highest order, for sure.
yeah, we call the wrong thing the devil.
Yeah.
But as well as when people talk about, say, lust. Number one, I think it's dangerous when we simplify what are complex issues.
Yes.
Number two, the second issue, and part of the reason we simplify it is because we don't have a history of thinking critically, even though that has been a deeply held value for the church across church history, at least in the earlier years. Secondly, we seem to not pay attention to what, if we're going to talk about demons, what Jesus called demons,
Yeah.
what Paul called demons, and how they function. Number one, Paul's greatest issue, and even Jesus' greatest issue, was not quote unquote the devil, it was doctrines of demons. In other words, toxic, destructive ideas that were rooted in the influence of the adversary or Satan, and that led to much destruction and denigration of individuals and communities. That's demon. Thirdly, thirdly, whatever's called, what scripture would call, first of all, there's no scriptural precedent for this whole idea of a spirit of lust.
Yeah.
But when it calls lust, it was speaking about destructive, obsessive, and denigrating and objectifying approaches to anyone or anything that strips them of their sense of value. So if you're going to talk about lust, you're talking about a selfish, self-aggrandizing desire or appetite that takes into consideration no one or anything else.
That's right.
Now, to me, that is the kind of lust that is deeply problematic. But Paul also said this: if y'all have such an issue with lust, Paul says, earnestly desire. That word desire, if my mind serves me correctly, which I think it does, it literally means lust after. In other words, passionately pursue spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. So you have to be far more grounded in your idea in your approach to some of this stuff. But I have found, particularly within, I'll be blunt, Black Pentecostal spaces, our people have such a history of oppression and a lack of support to help them navigate the realities of life. Because let's be honest, part of the reason we have so many fix quick help fix it idea notions within our theological spaces and our religious spaces is because we are historically oppressed.
Yeah.
So you want something to, you want to blame it on the devil. You want to make it something just evil, and this right here. This, if you fix this, it'll fix the problem. It's like when it is that you have a child, we laugh about it, but it's the truth. You have a child who is sick. What do they tell you? Give him some ginger ale.
Right.
Ginger ale and some crackers was the cure-all for every issue. Why? Because when people can't find real solutions to the problems that they're dealing with, and they find that truth be told, the quote-unquote solution is far more complex than they may like to consider. People just want the quickest answer. That's how we deal with finances. We treat it like gambling. That's why we're all about, you curse with a curse because you won't give that 10%.
Yeah.
So if it can't meet your need, it's a seed. Why? Because we're also recognizing that we want a quick help solution, due to the fact that if you really look at these issues critically that are facing us individually and corporately, you have to get into what is occurring on a systemic, on a macro level, that is causing the problems that we're faced with. And then you realize that the help that you're looking for is not going to be as quick, and it may not look how it is that you think it's going to be. And then you have to change, then you have to adjust, then you have to deal with realities internally and externally that many times people are not interested to deal with. So let's just call it a demon and go about our business.
Amen to that. It's like, it's today we have to have these types of conversations, right? Relative to what healthy sexual development, that's not rooted, as Lex was saying, in any formative or subjective view of text or a religious lens, right? Is evidence based, is rooted in science. If your pastor, and listen, faith spaces can be healthy spaces where these types of conversations can be had, when they're empowered with the right information, informed spaces relative to talking about human sexuality. They can be healthy spaces, but far too in between. We've seen more harm done than good in faith spaces when it comes to talking about healthy human sexuality. Why? Because there's this one way rigid view of seeing the human experience relative to someone's lack of theological exposure to scholarship, and take a wrong view of the text and actually weaponize the scriptures, weaponize the Bible against what's actually normative and normal to our human physiology, right? And we would have understood this if we've brought in, you know, a sex therapist to talk about the normal healthy functions of the human body relative to, you know, when how our body functions relative to sex.
But you,
Your pastor is not is not a be all when it comes to these types of topics. And I think one, we the onus is on the pastor, right? But I think two, the onus is on us being informed to being able to critically think. Don't lose your ability to critically think. What was you finna say, Lex?
I was going to say, well, I agree. I agree, and not to undermine what you're saying, but to bring a wider scope to it. That things that I think we need to consider. Number one, part of the reasons we can't even have quote healthy discussions with sex and sexuality, say with with legitimate folk who specialize in this is first of all within the black community, we have this idea that the pastor, just like the barber, is the solution to everything. So there, so the position of the senior pastor and the leader is held up because they hold almost kind of a demigod like status,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's held to be such a demigod like status because in part you are held to an idea and to a posture that is almost akin to idolatrous, and that you are supposed to be the singular promulgator and proponent
yeah,
for the notions that we've held to for years, and
yeah,
which is one of the reasons why when you look at you don't see black leaders typically being at the forefront of fostering revolutionary ideas that challenge the status quo.
yeah,
It's reformation. Most reformative ideas that I have heard as a follower of Jesus came through white people because our spaces don't allow for it. Second, because we punish you for thinking differently,
yeah,
and you will lose your career, your life, your money. You'll lose that, and then let's be quite honest. Our black church leaders are dealing with the same issues and challenges as the black community, and within the black community, if you are different, we punish you for it,
yeah,
and we expect our black church leaders to be the maintainers of the status quo. And we don't come to church or we don't gather because we want to be delivered and empowered. We want to be excited. We want you to perform our weddings and our funerals, be there to counsel us, and not really press us individually or intergenerationally to be better or to be different. Secondly, the next issue to consider is that black people in general have a bad history with the subject matter of sex, because as people who were enslaved, anything related to sex, we were objectified, we were subjugated, and we were mistreated. Our bodies were used like chattel. You know, to this day, let's be quite honest, as black men, the BBC. That is still very much the idea that is held about us within the wider social reality. As men of color, we are expected and held to this notion that we are to be unfeeling,
yeah,
incompetent beasts,
yeah,
and that the best thing about us is our physical strength, the virility apparently that we tend to bring to bear in the minds of other people, and what it is assumed that we can undo sexually.
that's good.
So we don't have a healthy sexual ethic. Thirdly, I mean, if we really are going to get into dealing with these subject matter sex regarding sex, it is disruptive. It is disruptive within the church because it's going to be disruptive in our homes, because you look to your pastor and to your church leader to be the one to quote unquote disciple you, whatever that how it is that we tend to think that is. And so if your and then Side note that remind me not to leave that thought. I can tell you, I deal with a lot of church leaders, and a lot of church leaders are themselves struggling when it comes to sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
I know amazing men of God who love their communities of faith, who serve them well and are sacrificing extensively for them. They cannot be themselves because
Yeah.
they are same gender loving. I know women who are in the same place. Then let's talk about the fact that there are church leaders who are quite polyamorous, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
And there is an entire spectrum regarding sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
And when you begin to bring these ideas that have been fostered, watch this, in more mainstream spaces, but you bring it to people and communities that live on the margins, then it's more explosive. And the ramifications of the good and the bad become
Yeah.
far more difficult. So I think that when it comes to dealing with sex and sexuality, whether you're talking about not just what people do in bed. When you talk about just a physical, a
Yeah.
legitimate aspect of who it is that people are, you're going to run into a lot of major issues that church leaders, to be quite blunt, are not educated enough to address.
That's
They're
it.
not economically empowered enough to address.
Yeah.
They are not socially engaged or supported enough to address. I mean, when I made my comments about my thoughts regarding LGBTQIA, and that I pretty much shot any kind of ministry success that I may have desired within the mainstream context where I
That's
serve.
right.
I killed it, and I'm glad I did. I don't regret it. But the ramifications of this bull is real.
Yeah.
So you don't have place and space to deal with this stuff within church, because church, as unfortunately how it's being developed and nurtured within our ages, doesn't allow for that, and is rooted ultimately in Gnostic thought, and
Yeah.
we could get into that at some point in other point in time. And it requires either entire reformation, or just rebuild or building something new, which takes time, energy, money, and generations. And to be quite honest, most people just are not willing to kind of pay that price. And the only thing sometimes I'm just trying to do is help church leaders to do less damage,
Yeah.
and then to help them behind the scenes work with individuals whose wellness and whose capacity to thrive necessitates a more renewed understanding.
Yeah.
And or at the very least, and I'm grateful for some of the leaders that I know that are kind of doing this work. A friend of mine who is a bishop in his own Reformation, an apostle, apostolic leader, he is presently studying social justice, and he just recently he said, Lexi, I want to thank you for how you've challenged me over these last several years, because he's studying LGBTQ issues
Good.
and things he did not know,
Yeah.
and the history, and he was so shocked at all of this occurring, because they see queer people, they see what is done on the streets, and even some of the wild actions, and there is this lack of knowledge and lack of understanding leads to the propagation of a lot of prejudice and bias that's reinforced. And
Yeah.
then church leaders, in their commitment to uphold the integrity of the faith, of what they consider to be holiness in Jesus, in turn do so much damage to people who are just acting out of their trauma, because we in many ways helped to create the trauma. We
Yeah.
did the damage, and now because we don't own up to it, or we didn't know that it was our predecessors who called themselves Jesus followers that did it, we're now turning around to judge the very people who are suffering in many ways because of our own whipping of them.
Yeah. 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 This is so good. I guess. I guess too, when we can kind of land the plane here, and I think maybe having another dialogue relative to um, this conversation, because it is nuance, and I think we're only touching we're only touching the fringes,
Mhm.
of this conversation, y'all. But I think one in part, what I'm kind of hearing and taking in this conversation, at least for me, is one, there is an onus on you consider the consumer, right, when it comes to what we consume in faith spaces, that the consumer in these faith spaces, the onus is on us, relative to the church space and the church experience that we're looking to have, right? um, for those that are that are genuinely looking to grow in their faith. You have to take, that has to become important to you. Like where they say, where the pastor talk about where you go to get fed at, um, where you getting fed at. You can have ownership in that experience, and make a choice and an informed decision relative to where you get fed at. That you can have a space where a pastor, can recognize it, and again, because you said it earlier too, Lex, ethics, right? Where the pastor recognized the limitations, of their own education, and or experiences or training or lack thereof, and is transparent enough in faith spaces to say, hey, guys, I don't know it all relative to this. Here's some resources. That's healthy.
It is healthy. It is, Jermaine, it is healthy, but um, and I love how you think, because you're offering the strategy too. I have to. My challenge is that my part seems to be showing the underbelly and the subterranean reality
Yeah.
that creates this type of
Yeah.
support, makes it very, very difficult. Number one, the and I'm trying not to cuss. The pulpit of today was the pew of yesterday,
Yeah.
and
That's
the
good.
pulpit of today brings to bear all of the preconceived notions, the ideas, the challenges, and all of that stuff to the pulpit,
That's good.
because that's what they learned in the pew. So it's
That's
multi-generational,
good.
and so there is that. Number two, there is the fact that church is a capitalistic venture.
Yeah.
It is not supposed. Let's be clear. It's not
Boom.
supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a consumeristic capitalistic venture. In other words, it much of it is dictated to by money. It is dictated to by resources. It is dictated to, and I mean, in terms of, but not in terms of what is done and what is considered valuable, is dictated to fundamentally by money. Now, I'm not saying that resources don't matter, that we shouldn't consider cents and dollars and all that stuff. But when truth is something that we're willing to compromise for cash, we're in trouble. But the reality is, our idea of truth in in is very much rooted in dollars and cents. And so
Yeah.
we foster a theological narrative that fuels and enforces whatever belief we want to hold on to, even if it's not allowing us to be free. Because freedom comes at a cost that many preachers and many church ministers aren't prepared for. And I'll have to admit, especially for people of color who have had a history of suffering, who've had a history of marginalization, to now beholden to the integral understanding of church and of Jesus Christ, and to recognize at its core, that in truth it was not about money, dollars and cents,
Yeah.
and about you having the American dream. If you bring that to bear and you tell them that to truly follow Jesus, the way that is offered by Christ, that you suffer, that you really in fact suffered. I told my friends, I said, some of y'all went. I said, after y'all finally left the gospel, y'all became true Christians. I said, y'all show better. Y'all do a better example of being like Jesus than all the folks I know who speak in tongues and shout. And I mean that people like you, Jermaine, and some of my other folk. I said, one, it was like y'all. It's like when y'all finally left what y'all thought Christianity was and say F all of this, then y'all finally start showing up to be like Jesus. I'm like, this is what it took.
Yeah. 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 It does seem that way, that you have to get outside of Christendom, right? To find the reality and the essence and the message that the deconstructing rabbi, from Galilee was conveying to his audience at that time, is that, this idea of liberation is not relative to a location, right? The woman at the well told Jesus, he said, hey, you Jews go up to the temple. We, Samaritans come here at the well, Jacob's well. And Jesus like, hey, look, hey, it's coming a time and a place where men will begin to worship God in spirit and truth. He killed this idea about location, right? Programming, A lot of
The
things
thing
that
that
you're
we
saying,
obsess the most
right?
about
And
the
that this
church building
access to
children.
God, you got it right here and right now. You know what I mean? This is not about a location. It's not about the Jews going to the temple. It's not about the Samaritans going to Jacob's well. This reality of God is resident within you and your humanness and your humanhood. And so to demonize sexuality, or to not engage in a critical way when it comes to understanding our human physiology relative to sex and sexuality, is a is it's like it's not a you talk about honoring, worshiping God, right? You know what I mean? Worship God with your whole heart. And that also means your informed, educated heart too. When it comes to that. So we won't be holding to these silly ideas when it comes to things that can be explained relative to a person's lived experiences, ACEs, people childhood traumas, like you talked about, people living out of a kid and living out of their childhood traumas. And so a lot of the things that we demonize or coin or shape as lust very well may just be a person unpacking trauma in their life. But if our read is only religious dualism relative to my experience of what I got from the past before me, this is how we always done it. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And then the institution, not just the setting, the mindset of the people in the institution, all of it becomes unsafe, and it becomes an unhealthy place to unpack anything relative to human sexuality in those types of spaces.
It's
And
not just
so, go ahead.
not just human sexuality, unpacking anything, any
Yeah,
subject matter. I mean,
yeah,
I'll tell people, to be quite honest, one of the reasons that you rarely see me in church spaces around here is just because of the fact that I don't feel comfortable trying to build community with people that won't allow me to think.
yes,
That has no context and no place and space
that,
for any kind of idea, as well as I know that I'm educated enough, I'm informed enough, I am mature enough. I'm not trying to, you know, shift the whole church culture, but
right,
I'm not going to sit down and pretend as if I see the same thing that you see.
right.
And to me, if it is a reinfactor family, then part of the beauty of family is that we learn to sit with these matters and
It
issues and tensions for us to grow. But the reality is that we want group. What is really wanted are three things I found in church. Sadly, groupthink.
Yep,
Everybody hold the same notion. Number two, they want your attendance because the preacher or the pastor is the central figure, and the goal of the meeting, which is why we have such an excessive level of narcissism in the pulpit, is that whoever has the microphone, the focus of the meeting is to hear what they have to say,
yeah, that's true.
and whatever notion that they are propagating, that is the mind of God. That's why it is you hear church members, and you didn't hear these years ago. That's my man of God. That's my woman of God. That's my prophet. That's my pastor. And there's nothing wrong with holding someone with a measure of sacred affection and considering and appreciation how they impact you. But now it's a popularity thing too. It's not because someone is shaping or molding you into Christ. It's because your pastor or your leader is kind of a new popular social media figure, and and the goal is to establish their brand to the degree that other people want to come and lift them up too.
Yeah,
And so church is a great way to become popular if you are charismatic and if you can communicate well.
yeah,
You become popular, and the idea is to get you in front of as many people as possible, as opposed to being the one that is uplifting and empowering others to be more on the go ahead than you. And so I'm like, no, these I can't even remember what my main thought was, but these are kind of things and spaces that becomes far too troubling. And I'm like, I want no parts in it.
yeah,
And I'm definitely going to get. And then thirdly, the idea is that we want your money,
yeah,
we want your time, we want your service, and we want your obedience, and we want you to shut up.
Yeah.
Because if you do that, then whatever it is that we've determined that we're trying to accomplish will get done. Because ultimately, my spirituality transcends yours, and my place and maturity as the pastor, as the leader, is of greater weight and significance.
And that's a that's a that's a that's a disservice, man, to what we say we represent. It's underserving to a lot of people. It's a disservice relative to say that you are providing a service to people. And it just downright hinges at, being a cult, you all, relative to that, when you're not in a space that encourages you to critically think for yourself, right? And to test hypothesis of ideas, that are intergenerationally inherited, right? This is how the pastor saw it, and this is how we all supposed to see it, and not take in new information that maybe the way pastor saw it then is just what it was, and today with new information, we're well informed in generation, right? I love the idea that we are becoming a more trauma informed society, and equally to that, to a more self-informed society, right, relative to our own implicit biases, our own prejudices, and checking our own intellectual blinders within ourselves, right?
But,
uh,
but the
yeah.
reality is, Jermaine, to your point, you raise people up, and if you've done your job and served them well, you do the best that you can with what you
Yep.
know.
Yep.
But part of the growth process, I think, even people in positions of power, is that you have to be humble enough to get the pushback from those who followed your ideas into a different world, and they're
Yep.
able to tell you that, okay, what you said may have been culturally acceptable, but it wasn't truth,
Right.
because
That's it.
truth transcends generations.
That's it.
And that in of itself demands something that many leaders and churches don't want to do. It requires change, because it requires change, it requires repentance, it requires accountability, it requires correction, and it requires growth. Because if you, as a leader who was same gender loving, just say hypothetically, you thought that it was quote unquote your idea to kill the flesh, to kill the devil, blah 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 blah. And so you, like I've seen church leaders, you held to that wholeheartedly and steadfastly, and then you find out in 15, 20 years from someone that you developed, disciple who has a better understanding, and as society has progressed, to tell you no, that wasn't the truth. How do you therefore deal with reconciling with what you thought was true but wasn't true, and also dealing with the ramifications of being integral to that truth, not just individually but in your place of leadership,
Yeah.
and what all of that means, and all of the things that you now have to do. People, especially people who've been traumatized, we so want a measure of stability, and we're so afraid of change because you just wanted something. You wanted the American dream, and
Yeah.
now the very thing that you built, that was built upon lies as opposed to truth, becomes the thing that you have to now turn around and correct and watch fall.
Yeah.
And so many of them are not prepared, not willing to do it, and so they'd rather die on the hill, um, die on the cross of compromise, as opposed to now having to engage and relate. Because whenever you understand and come to new truth, and your mind is transformed, and you recognize that what you thought was truth was in fact a lie, you have to wrestle with all of that, and
Yeah.
truth requires a response,
Yeah.
and it creates a measure of accountability that for people who have suffered and have done as far as they're concerned, the best that they can do. They're not prepared for that, for the
Yeah.
psychological
Yeah.
ramification.
Yeah. That's true. You are absolutely right. And a lot of leaders are in those, um, you could say, that boxed in between those spaces, in their lives where they've deconstructed, a lot, but their income, is, like you said, is tied to this way of the way we've done it. And a lot of them is, that's That's their livelihood. And so to sacrifice that for the sake of, you know, the reality of what we say truth is, or those that found the real Jesus, right? Post bad theology, post bad Christian church experiences, to find this, you know, inclusive Jesus, right? This Jesus that's universal in heart, you know, that's representative of what we say that God is, right? Or we can identify in our human experience, relative then to the Jesus that's been weaponized, right? The homophobic Jesus, you know, the whitewashed Jesus, right? With the blonde hair and blue eye Jesus. We're moving away from those paradigms. And would you say, I guess we can land the plane here. Would you say that um uh, here, let me read this statement, and then you can close with that. I said this in a post. I said, heck, healthy sexual development in Christendom, it doesn't exist. Church Inc. is imploding on itself for sure. And I said that the context here goes beyond just the moral failures of church leaders relative to the ones we just heard about, right? And church leaders and celebrity preachers as depicted here. So there's an image. Charisma magazine had an image of Tony Evans, T.D. Jakes, Mike Bickle, and then the other guy.
Really,
Um,
they posted Jake's as well on Charisma.
yeah, yeah. And it says, have we finally come to the end of the road for the Christian celebrity era? And so, you know, I wrote this relative to this headline here. And I was saying that um, I said there's more nuance. I said there's a nuance and contextual conversation that's lacking in Christian spaces that these men facilitate, which severely lacks a deep awareness of human physiology as it relates to the human brain, the human body relative to sex and sexuality. The fundamentalist Christian framework towards sex and sexuality is most harmful. The framework is often counter to any clinical evidence based understanding, with little to no awareness to how the body works as it relates to human physiology and sex. And the framework and approach are often theologically flawed. Even worse, counterintuitive to human agency and psychologically harming to the human psyche, you know, which is the harm of things like Christian purity culture. And so seeing that, right, this conversation that we're having, what's what's the fix, I guess you could say, or if inclusion doesn't become a part of this paradigm, right, within the church space, it will there continue to be, you know, this hill, right, that you say that people are dying on, and we're seeing it, you know, across Christianity, where there's these a lot of these fundamental places are like imploding on themselves. These places where you get those rigid ideas about sex, sexuality, and marriage, binary ideas relative to that.
I think the solution is that at some point you'll have to stop trying to fix what is fundamentally broken, and you have to recognize that the house is falling apart
Mm.
and be willing to leave it and allow it to die. I don't doubt the power of God to change and transform, but I also recognize that it is a waste of time, energy, and expectation to invest into realities and communities that are steadfastly committed to who it is that they are and how they choose to function. So I'm in love. It's like going to see a family. There's a reason sometimes we only show up once a year. I may love you, I will respect you, but I'm not going to participate in your dysfunction. And eventually it and you will die. What I will do is create an alternative, and I will establish a space that gives voice and credence to what I know to be true, which
Yeah.
I'm assuming they have done the same, and hopefully I learn from their mistakes. I don't bash them. I will disagree. I will challenge notions, especially if I could deem them destructive. But I don't have to participate. That's all. I just stop participating.
And stop participate.
Stop
That's
participating. And if we stop participating, stop giving them our money, our time, energy, resources, and our support, our expectations. When the river stops flowing, eventually some people determine, okay, we need to find another source. And that's what's happening right now. So I don't care about being a Christian celebrity. To be quite honest, the Christian celebrities, as far as I'm aware, didn't care to be ones either. But nevertheless, you just don't participate in it. I do my part, allow others to do their part, and I leave the rest to God. Because if I try to get myself involved in all of these complex situations and scenarios, I'm not paid for it. I'm not appreciated for it. I don't think I have to do it. I'm just going with my
good.
life.
That's good. That's good. And you talked about, I guess we can close here too. I guess this would be in looking forward, because there are a lot of people, like you said, leaders that are recognizing, right, what they inherited from generations before, was for that time, right, in perspective, and are recognizing a need to pivot, right? You said those things that require to change. There are some who are doing the introspective work, I call it, relative to reform, who are shaking the trees out there. What does that look like? What does a reformed space look like? In talking to some leaders that may be out there, and hearing this conversation, and was like, yeah, I can identify with that. But are willing to put in the work. What does a reform space look like?
Well, number one, in terms of if you're talking about creating a reform space that fosters a healthy view of sexuality and sex, at least particularly within that, the first thing I would say is there is no one size fit all mentality, and I think that is something that we're going to need to accept that that who you are, and I hope leaders understand this, who it is that you are dictates and determines the type of creation, the culture, and the climate that you tend to build, and you allow great space for. So if you want to know what is it supposed to look like, it looks like you, which means that if you as a leader aren't doing the work your own self, if you're hiding from yourself, if you are not fostering and walking with a healthy understanding personally, then what's going to happen is that anything you create is going to testify to that. We saw that with the downfall in this, and he's trying to resurrect himself of this black charismatic version of the seeker friendly church movement, that collective. That thing all fell apart. The leaders left, and all of their praises and things that they were doing, it's pretty much being a bad cover up for what's just being a messy situation where I think at the end of the day, folk just made a lot of money and now go about their own business, and everyone has their own locations and their own collectives and their movements and whatnot. But in that space, what became clear is who that leader was, him and his spouse, was testified to through all that they produced and everything that came to be. And the lies that you nurture, the ways that you hide from yourself will always show up in the work you build and how it is that you preach, teach, and what you give license to. So I would say that for any leader, the thing that needs to be done is that there needs to be a continual commitment to turning to Jesus, particularly if it is that you're the faith of Jesus Christ,
Mhm.
allowing yourself to be critically engaged in examination of a lot of issues and topics. Be willing to be wrong, to take a step forward, to have to correct that and continue moving forward, and to set your focus critically on serving people in a way that makes them better, that allows for them to heal, that allows for them to feel as if that their identity and who it is that they are is not something that must be hidden when it comes to, if it is, we can talk about, particularly when it comes to church. And like I said, those are glossy answers because I'll have to get into a lot of nuances and so
Yeah.
many different realities. But I think my greatest fear, Jermaine, and this is my greatest issue. My greatest issue is that people who call themselves leaders in the church have forsaken who Christ is. They've forsaken who Christ is for the Bible. They've forsaken who Christ is for their desire to be how they understand to be inclusive. They they forsake Jesus, and because he doesn't remain the central focus, we keep getting off, and then we cease to be, in many ways, what is the Church of Jesus Christ. That is my concern. I have no issues with interfaith spaces. I have no issues with new thought communities and everything. That for me, the reality is that if you're going to be integrally committed to what you say is Jesus and the faith of Christ, what it says to be a Christian, that there are legitimate realities that are the core, the ethos, that are the core, the ethic that drives that plumb line. And we could disagree on many number of issues, but it just keeps feeling like I'm dealing with Judas these days. Folk just betray him for the fact that they just want to be neo spiritual, and then they don't have the integrity to call it for what it is.
Yeah.
And that becomes a problem for me, because for me that's deceptive.
Yeah.
And if you and it's the reality that people want to foster communities of quote unquote being safe and acceptance, but they run from the reality of what it meant,
Yeah.
and a Christian culture that is void of us suffering so that we can love, embrace, and engage each other. As far as I'm concerned, I have no respect for it, and I don't consider it in any way to be faithful to who Jesus is and what was offered to us in the history of the church. To me, it is antichrist, it is unfaithful, and it's a lack of integrity. Because if you can be something, just say it, be it. And I will respect you and engage you as it. But
Yeah.
people don't want that. They want their own, the reality that fosters what is their personal pleasure, which is the issue that we have now in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, my my goal, my aim, my hunger, right, today is a more authentic spirituality, right? That fosters my authenticity, that's relative to my lived experiences, and how I see the world today. And that's far in contrast to my old Christian self, for sure. But I think being authentic, that should be foundational. Authenticity, that word, that term should be foundational, no matter what spiritual formation you take. And if your religion robs you of that what that means for you relative to your own human experience, I think those are red flags enough for us to raise and say, again, that this is one, we're talking to pastors, but to have these types of conversations so that we can be informed about the spaces we choose to entertain, and what we're subjecting our spiritual journey to, that we can take ownership, and still have reverence and relevance for pastors in our spiritual journey, but shaped in a way that's healthy, that's empowering, so that we can be informed and educated in our spiritual experience. I always tell people, every time you go to church, I probably won't, I probably won't be in those spaces, but if you do go, if you choose to go, take this with you to church, right? We take this with us for sure. But in this time, in this day and age, we need to take both in with us, as we engage these faith spaces, because not all are genuine, not all are true to form relative to Christ. It is a money exchange experience. It is a space where people's narcissism It's a house of narcissism. It's built for the pleasure of the one and not the many, right? But there are spaces that are out here, healthy church spaces, they may not be physical. Virtual spaces are emerging, but there is a change, there's a transition and a reformation that is occurring. But it's conversations like these that are important, and we need to have. And I thank you, Lex, for being on here with our irreligious family. And this is a conversation I think that is nuanced, and I think we'll dig more into this. Maybe just have kind of a dialogue and pick Lex's brain because there's a lot there relative to this topic. I think that could be beneficial for churches that could build a framework, a model. And I think that's another thing that pastors should lean into is consider, your models of approach, to the message that you bring, and consider those models that's informative to the whole person, a whole person model. Systems that know need to change, recognize, that there are institutionally there are things that we need to change, even when it comes to our approach. And I think institutionally, there are things that pastors can do relative to change that can help foster a healthy transition, into a more inclusive space, whether that's a pastor, imam, or whoever. But yeah, that's it. That's all. Thank y'all. Thanks, Lex, man.
It's my pleasure.
Let me